For anyone concerned about climate change, there's a lot to celebrate. Efforts around the world are showing benefits. And here in Canada, many provinces are stepping up and putting action plans in place. Can you feel the air getting less CO2-ish? But there is benefit in being critical of our own efforts so that we can keep ourselves honest. And the new report from Canada's Commissioner of the Environment on the state of Canada's progress isn't necessarily all that great. Didn't have time to read the report? Well, in this video, we'll talk about what's in the report, what has caused us to get where we are right now, how to get further down the road to being serious about climate change, and why everybody of all political stripes are on the verge of putting aside their partisan jabs, and any day now we'll start working the problem together. So, very quickly, the Commissioner of the Environment is a non-partisan, objective check on the government's progress on climate change plans. He issued his report in November 2023, and unfortunately, he said there's no freaking way we're going to hit that 2030 target. I think that might be a direct quote. But maybe it's not as much of a wildfire as it might appear. Why are we unlikely to hit our target? Well, things happen, like pandemics and opposition parties and a general lack of urgency. Look, the current plan is a halfway decent plan. It's ambitious, it could still be workable, but you can't just sit back and relax after you put a plan together. You actually have to do something with it, and we could be doing a lot more to speed things up. More on how we fix that in a couple of minutes, but for now, what did the Commissioner's report say? The Commissioner of the Environment found that 95% of the measures in the plan don't even have a 2030 reduction target, and only 45% of the measures have an implementation deadline, and only 43% of the measures in the plan are expected to have some direct impact on emissions. Yikes! The report also finds the accountability for reducing emissions is spread across multiple federal entities, but I don't know, that doesn't seem disastrous to me. That actually seems good rather than focusing it all in one place. You just need to coordinate amongst all of those entities. Other issues with the plan are that the list of things that were identified in a previous Minister of the Environment report weren't prioritized, and the potentially really effective ones have been delayed. Another nice graphic to show how far off target we are in Canada right now comes from the 440 megatons website. 440 megatons, by the way, is the target for Canada to reach by 2030. They've got a lot of interesting things on there where you can not only see the projected emissions gap in Canada, 137 megatons is shown in this graph, but also various sources of emissions from cement production, tar sands in Alberta, passenger transportation. It's another way to shine a light on those places where we're not doing as much as we should be. Speaking of industries not doing enough to reduce emissions, Canada's oil and gas sector still sits atop the pollution leaderboard, accounting for 28% of national emissions. Wow! And despite what some in the industry are trying to tell us, we have yet to see a real reduction in emissions, even though they've committed to 22 megatons annually until reaching net zero. And, by the way, that same oil and gas sector only contributes 7% to the national economy. I realize it's the most important industry in Alberta, so transitioning away from oil and gas would be the same as the world ending for that province. But for the rest of Canada, it's only 7% of the economy. So none of the bull about that sector being more important to the Canadian economy than it actually is. In the Commissioner's report, 2 of the really effective measures that are on the way but not yet implemented are a cap on oil and gas emissions and fuel efficiency standards. As for a cap, the current Environment Minister recently announced the plan while attending COP28 in Dubai. And to give the oil and gas industry a very small amount of credit, as much as it pains me to say that, they agree a cap should be put in place too. It's just their cap is teeny tiny compared to what it actually needs to be. The oil and gas industry says that to achieve the government's required emissions reduction for the industry, they would have to leave 1 to 2 million barrels of oil per day in the ground. Yep, your point? I'll admit that I'm no expert on the oil and gas sector in Canada, but it doesn't make sense to me that when we know the sector is the biggest polluter, and worldwide we need to reduce drastically the amount of fossil fuels we use, how can we trust those in the industry when they're doing everything they can to expand production? Doesn't that seem counterintuitive? Couldn't we help the entire planet by leaving more of the stuff in the ground? As for fuel efficiency standards, final regulations came partially into effect in July 2023, after first committing to have these in place in 2019. This one has a big impact and is estimated to reduce emissions by over 26 megatons per year. Strangely, there is some opposition to these clean fuel standards, and while I clearly don't understand chemistry enough to know how hard it must be to make fuel cleaner, I'm baffled as to why anyone would be against trying. That extreme opposition is centered in Alberta, where I know they don't have leaders with positive ideas to transition the economy, but it really is important to move away from an industry that is such a huge polluter. All is not lost though, even with Alberta wanting to ratchet up oil and gas production. According to the Climate Institute, when looking at the government's plan from 2022, if all of the current policy commitments are somehow enacted right away, the gap in meeting the 2030 emissions target is just 15 megatons. Missing the target by 15 megatons is a whole lot better than missing it by 137. But to enact all of those commitments is going to require incredibly strong will and sacrifice by everyone. But we're up to the task, aren't we? Well, maybe not all of us quite yet. An Ipsos poll published in September 2023 shows that about 60% agree the government needs to act now. That's a solid majority. And when it comes to financial impact, only 35% say now is not the right time to be investing in climate change initiatives. I know we all wish that number was even lower, but still, it means that a healthy majority isn't quite that anti-environment. Across the different Canadian provinces, the numbers are mostly the same, except in Alberta, of course, where only 26% agree more needs to be done about climate change. Oh, Ontario is worth mentioning too, where in the survey, 45% of those over the age of 35 wouldn't pay extra income tax to fight climate change. And sure, I get it, life is expensive, but I really do believe that the outcomes of climate change are even more expensive. The longer you wait to deal with a problem, the more expensive it's going to be. Pay a bit more now instead of paying a lot more later to live on a dying planet. The Commissioner of the Environment report ends as reports do, with recommendations. And these are recommendations that we can accomplish as members of a caring society. There is always hope. In fact, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives recently published on their website a guide for you and me called Don't Wait for the State. The guide is a blueprint for us all to enact climate change activities at a grassroots level, including case studies to show us how small things can make a difference. It makes me feel even better when I think that while governments are a hugely necessary part of the solution to our climate crisis, we all need to be part of the solution, and this resource can help us figure out how to do a little bit ourselves. One of the key things that we can do is to know the actual facts about the tools Canada and many other countries are using to fight climate change, including the best one we have right now, the carbon tax. There's a lot of doom and gloom talk about the carbon tax. Oh my, taxation is evil, the carbon tax has to go. Watch this other video specifically about the carbon tax, where you'll hear me essentially say, chill out, relax about the tax. It's not costing 80% of Canadians anything. And why not subscribe to this channel as well? It won't help in a direct way to fighting climate change, but it'll be entertaining, I promise.